Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, we are having discussion on political thought and process. And so far we have discussed the Western political thinker and also little about the Kautilya. But today our main focus would be to know the dominant feature of Indian political thought and various streams. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Satish Jha, eminent political science thinker, and he teaches political science in Delhi University and writes for different journals on different current political process, and also try to see the political process in the eye of thought given by the eminent thinker. So I hope his experience and knowledge will help us to understand the political process and political thought in a new perspective. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Jha for EduSet lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
You know, any discussion on Indian political thinking or thought is little bit complex as well as challenging because of certain misconceptions which are prevalent in social science discourse, not only in India but also in West. And most of the things which we have here regarding this misconception are derived from the understanding which has developed in the West about both Indian philosophy and Indian thought. So for a number of years, we were told, and most of the writings which were emerging from the West basically represented this perception that thought is basically Western enterprise, and only the Western philosophy and Western political thinkers need to be studied because they are the only ones who have engaged with knowledge, truth, and other aspects which characterize both philosophy and thought. So I think Indian political thinking was dismissed either as an activity which was only reflecting the identity problem which the Indians and in particular and the people of the East in general were facing vis-a-vis West. Therefore, instead of presenting it as a discourse regarding truth, knowledge and emancipation, I think Indian thought was looked at as if it was only expression and articulation of identity problem or identity complex. So I think Indian political thought suffered because of this for number of years. Now it was believed that it is only the West which has created a more coherent and systematic discourse over the ages, particularly in terms of their quest for building utopia, or they have produced a whole corpus of ideas through which the emancipatory discourse has been created by these thinkers in the West, which are totally absent in Indian political thinking, because Indian political thinkers were not concerned with the larger issues of humanity. I mean, in terms of issues which relate to the issue of emancipation, issues which relate to freedom, issues which relate to human civilization, and so on and so forth. In other words, one can say that Indian political thought was seen, or as was interpreted, as if it was a very narrow particularistic concern of certain people at certain period of time who had to deal with some of certain issues which pertain to very a narrow or a handful of people in that society, and therefore it didn't have wide-ranging implication. It didn't have wide appeal and implications for the humanity. So therefore, I think that Indian political thought has been reeling under this misconception for quite some time. Now, only recently, or in fact one can say that for last 15 to 20 years, one can say there is a creative engagement, and a kind of interrogation of such perception about the Indian political thinking, and it has been stated very forcefully that it is not only the West which was concerned with the utopia building project, it was not only the West which was concerned with the emancipation discourse, but in fact some of the Indian thinkers had also engaged with these issues in the same way as perhaps some Western thinkers had engaged in their own context and in terms of their own situation. So therefore, attempt is being made to understand the dynamics of Indian political thinking and the context in which it developed and the complexity through which it basically moves, and therefore now we have a more profound understanding of Indian political thought as compared to what we had earlier. Now, Indian political thought therefore has to basically has to work at two levels. I mean, any study of Indian political thought has to work at two levels. Number one, to deal with certain misconceptions about Indian political thinking, and some of the misconceptions I have just now mentioned, that it is identity politics, it is not political thought. And then, apart from dealing with these misconceptions, the another aspect of this process is to see that what are the salient characteristics, features of this process, thought process, which developed in India over the years, over the ages. So I think these two pronged challenges, stare us in our face when we deal with Indian political thought today. Now, it is true that some of the things, some of the issues, particularly in modern Indian political thinking, when we look at it, in fact, they emerged as identity problem, because in context of the colonial onslaught, I think this identity question was important question. Therefore, no one can deny that identity issues or concerns were totally absent from Indian thinking. They were there. But the thing is that how these concerns were, harmonized with the larger concern, concern of emancipation and larger quest for, freedom and other human values. So this is what important issue we should keep in our mind. Now, when it comes to the identity question, one should also remember that not only Indian political thinkers in modern times, when dealing with colonialism, articulated their concerns, larger concerns in form of the identity challenge they had at that time, particularly in light of the hegemony of Western, ideas and Western discourse. But even in the West, if we look at the trajectory of their thought, even in the West, in fact, this identity issue was not altogether absent. In fact, there were various extremes. There were traditions and the counter traditions within, the same, thinking, in the same process, within the same society. And number of issues at times, were struggling to find a space, political space within that society, and therefore identity questions were also coming up again and again in the Western political thought. Of course, the form and the nature was different from what we had in India, largely because perhaps we had to face the onslaught of colonial power. So I think this identity issue is totally misplaced, number one, because it is believed that since it is an identity politics, hence there is no thought, and there cannot be any claim for universal knowledge or any knowledge which can lead to emancipation. Now, when we look at the normal perceptions which were basically prevalent in the Western world about the Indian political thought, and many of us also bought this argument. The second misconception, apart from this identity thing and the utopia, utopia building project, the third misconception has been that Indian political thought from the very beginning has been society centric, and therefore there is no notion of power, there is no notion of statecraft, there is no notion of political obligation, there is no notion of rights, because it is a duty centric discourse. So therefore there are many aspects which are missing from Indian political thinking, which are required for any enterprise to be which can qualify for this characterization as political thought. Now, it is true that society has been a predominant influence on Indian political thinking, but that does not mean that Indian political thinkers did not engage with the power and the statecraft. In fact, forget about the modern period when this power discourse was quite prominent in Indian political thinking and thought, because of the predominance of the colonial state and the power which it wielded on Indian society and Indian people. But even in earlier times, in fact, this concern was very much there, and therefore I think that after particularly people discovered Kautilya's Arthashastra, which essentially is a treatise on the statecraft and state power, and it's more regarding the discourse is more prominent, particularly in terms of its engagement with the power of different types. I think such misconceptions should not have any place in our discourse, because this Kautilya's Arthashastra establishes one thing very clearly, that from the ancient times Indians were engaging with this issue as systematically as perhaps the Greeks had at that period of time, which is invoked by the Western tradition in political thought and politics as a reference point. So if we compare the ancient Greek political thinking with the ancient Indian political thinking in terms of its engagement with the state and power, we find that it is equally profound, and in fact its salience cannot be contested and denied. Now, the next misconception about Indian political thought has been that Indian political thought is basically what we understand by Indian political thought, or what we try to study under this broad rubric Indian political thought, is nothing but theology. It is basically a religious study of a particular religion, and there are certain concerns, issues which come up, but they are essentially the concerns of religious groups in society, or concerns of a particular religion. So therefore the philosophy has also been understood, the Indian philosophy has also been understood or has been sought to be interpreted as adjunct of a religion, and therefore it has not been provided any separate or autonomous space in the thinking process. Now, it is very unfortunate, because it is true that religion, particularly the Hinduism in ancient times and to some extent even in subsequent periods, informed many such thinking, but that does not mean that Indian political thought was essentially a theological activity. I think science, the relationship between religion, philosophy and science is quite complex. Therefore, while dismissing Indian political thought as adjunct of religion or an activity, theological activity, we should also remember the trajectory of the Western political thought and philosophy. In fact, I don't have time to go into the details, but one should remember one thing, that the origin of modern science lies in philosophy, and Western philosophy is intimately connected with the discourse of religion in the West. Therefore, the relationship between religion, philosophy and science one can also see in the Western context, not only in India, but when it comes to West, this has been considered to be a progressive evolution where the inputs were provided for creative thinking. Rather, one can say that inputs from religion were harnessed for the growth and evolution of science as well as philosophy. But when it comes to India, it has been dismissed as if they were simply regressive, or it was understood in terms of tradition modernity frame through which perhaps the Western social science has tried to interpret Indian discourse from the very beginning. Now, apart from this charge of theology, that Indian political thought is not thought per se, Indian philosophy and thought are basically part and parcel of larger discourse of religion, therefore it is theological activity. The another a misconception, or one can say that allegation, has been that in India there has been no discourse of truth, because whatever was discussed in name of truth was simply a discourse of dharma or duty, and therefore the fine line between the truth and the duty was never defined and articulated the way it should have been. Now, it is true that Indian discourse of dharma has been part and parcel of Indian political thinking, but at the same time this discourse of dharma has been quite complex. The dharma discourse has been quite complex. Now, there is now a whole host of writings which have tried to establish that dharma cannot either be translated as a religion, nor it is equivalent to truth. Therefore, it is one of the dimensions of the larger discourse of truth in Indian political thinking, and therefore simply dismissing it as a dharmic discourse, a discourse of dharma or duty. And in fact, this translation of duty is also not quite proper, because dharma is not exactly translatable into this duty. So therefore, I think this is also unfair to to not accord Indian political thinking a proper place, because the concerns of truth have been articulated in certain forms which are not understandable with the available categories in the West, and therefore this conception that Indian political thought does not deserve a separate treatment because of the absence of a discourse of truth is also highly contestable. Now, a related feature of this truth dimension has been that Indian concern with the truth has been empirical or experiential. I mean, one can say that this yogic model of truth, I mean yoga, I mean whatever you experiment, that is only truth, and therefore it has been alleged that this model of truth is highly subjective, and because it is subjective, it varies from individual to individual, from subject to subject, from context to context. Therefore, there is no scope for any objectivity in this truth. In other words, one can say that it is not communicable. Intersubjective communicability, which is considered to be one of the important dimensions of scientific knowledge or truth, is not possible in this discourse, because this has been from the very beginning based on experiences, and experiences are so varied, therefore there is no possibility of any universal universal frame through which this truth discourse can be articulated. Now, it is true that experience has been considered from the very beginning very important dimension of this discourse of truth in India, but at the same time it is much more nuanced and complex than it is normally understood to be. Now, one should also understand that this experience has been part and parcel of the Indian thinking process in some other way also. For example, this mind body dichotomy, I mean this dualism of the modern West, which many people associate with the Cartesian revolution or originated with Descartes, I think this mind-body dichotomy has from the very beginning been, was discarded in Indian political thinking, and instead the dominant theme or the feature or discourse in Indian political thought from the very beginning has been this Advait, the non-dualist, non-dualist frame. I mean, there is no dualism, the dichotomy between facts and values, between theory and practice, between mind and body, and between nature and culture. So I think this sort of dualism, which characterizes the most modern, West, particularly in terms of the evolution of its modern science, modern philosophy, and modern knowledge system, that has been from the very beginning, questioned in India. And now even in West, we find that this dualist tragedy, as one can put it, because the way this dualism has led to whole host of problems, both in terms of knowledge generation, knowledge dissemination, and its implications both for nature and culture and the people. I think now they are also realizing the limitation of this discourse. But India from the very beginning was alive to this challenge, and therefore I think one important feature of this discourse has been this non-dualism, this Advait, what is normally understood in Indian context. Now, so therefore this experience, I mean understanding or approaching a reality, or the quest for truth through experience, has been part of this larger discourse of non-dualism. That how one can seek knowledge by experimentation. One can only try to develop a particular knowledge or develop a particular argument, or one should try to go for certain processes which can lead to knowledge generation, which should be tested and tested on one's own subjecthood. Therefore, this experiential feature of this knowledge building project in India has been largely influenced by this non-dualist, worldview, or one can say the non-dualist mindset, which has been the characteristic of Indian political thought. Now, so therefore this charge of subjectivity, that entire Indian enterprise of truth and theory building or knowledge acquisition is subjective, not objective, because it is experiential, and experiences are always relative. Therefore, there is no possibility in a scope for universal theory building or universal knowledge development, or any discourse which can have some relevance or some implication or some application for whole of humanity, not only in those contexts, those societies, those people among which it has developed. And hence, since Indian political thought doesn't have these features, therefore it cannot qualify for a political thought per se, which is basically concerned with the universal ideas, universal knowledge, universal truth, and therefore the discourse of emancipation. So I think this misconception has been very dominant, that entire Indian enterprise is a identity related enterprise, and therefore it doesn't qualify to be called a political thought or political thinking, and to some extent even philosophy, political or otherwise. So I think these are some of the major allegations, I will call it allegations, major criticisms, and in other words one can say these are the misconceptions, because they are far from the truth, because of the incomplete understanding, or one can say the partial understanding of the entire thing. Such notions were harbored by the Western world, and some of us in India also bought these arguments because of the colonization of mind, which has been going on for many years, particularly since the onset of colonialism. Now, before I move on to the next issue, there are 2-3 more misconceptions which have to be mentioned here. The another misconception is that Indian political thought is metaphysical, and therefore it cannot deal with the challenges of the material world. I mean, the major argument in this genre is that Indian political thought concerns about the issues which do not pertain to this world. I mean, this is otherworldly. For example, the kind of understanding Max Weber had about Indian religion, that there are certain religions which are otherworldly, there are certain religions which are this worldly. So the similar thing about the Indian political thought, that Indian political thought is metaphysical. It doesn't deal with this world, it deals only with the world which is in imagination, the world which is believed to be to present outside this material world where we live. So therefore, I think this discourse is speculative, imaginative, lacking any viability in the material context, and therefore this does not deserve to be treated as a political thought. Now, the similar argument is also given about the nature of this whole corpus of ideas called Indian political thought. That in India there is no political thought, only history of political thought. Because what we study here, Indian political thought, is only history of Indian society, the history of Indian people, and at the same time we also study the history of political ideas as they have developed in the West. So therefore, there is no serious activity called political thought, where the thinkers have engaged in a more systematic and scientific way about the issues concerning people and their society, which we can see in the West from the ancient Greek to the modern times, and therefore in India this is not there. In fact, what we study in name of political thought is the study of Indian history. I mean, the way the Indian people have have lived their lives, the way the Indian people have borrowed ideas from different societies, different culture, and therefore it is a history, it is not political thought. Now, to some extent one can say that this allegation has some basis, because what we were doing earlier was that we were doing history of political thought, in the sense that there was hardly any systematic attempt to engage with those people who engaged with their own reality in India and tried to develop their own ideas in context of the challenges which were being thrown by their society, their people, their culture, by their material development. Instead, we tried to basically study and review the ideas of the West, and therefore till very recently most of the curriculum in social science, particularly related to the political thought, included the major portion at least included the study of Western political thought. And just in passing or in brief, in order to do some lip service, somewhere it was mentioned that these were the thinkers who these were the people who have some ideas which can also be considered for political thinking. So this was one of the lacuna of our studies of political thought in Indian universities and Indian colleges and even in schools. But things are not changing. I will come back to this later, but this misconception led to this situation where the entire approach, attempt to approach our own resources of political thinking was lopsided and defective, and therefore this misconception gained ground. And therefore, when it was alleged that Indian politics or Indian society doesn't have political thought but only history, I think it added a lot of credence to it. But now I think things are changing very fast, and I will come back to this issue, that how we are engaging now not only with the Western thinkers and not only with the history of our own society, but also the way that history produced challenges and how certain people took those challenges to come forward with their own imagination, own reflection, own perception, which are as profound as some of the Western ideas, particularly in terms of the understanding of progress, freedom, civilization, and emancipation. So I think these are some of the misconceptions we should be careful. We should be very careful while studying Indian political thought. Now coming back to the next issue, that these misconceptions have been taken head on in recent years, particularly in last 20 years, one can say. Now there is a clear-cut break from such imitative discourse, one can put it as imitative discourse, because earlier attempts were only to imitate what was the understanding and perception in the West about us, but now there is an attempt to break from this imitative discourse, and now there is a very systematic attempt to engage with the Indian thinkers on their own terms, not through the frame, through the categories and through the terms set by the Western discourse. So I think this is a major development in last 20 years or 20 to 30 years, one can say. Now this engagement, the new engagement, is not only in terms of the interpretation of our own resources, political resources, philosophical resources. It's not only in terms of the interpretation of those texts, those contexts and those subjects who basically engaged with this challenge, but it is also a kind of dialogue, and one can say that it is a kind of two-way traffic of ideas, where the context, the text and the subject, the three important variables which are there for Indian political thinking and Indian political thought, are basically subjected to a rigorous engagement with the present. And in this context, the present includes the today's society, today's challenges and today's interpretation. As a social scientist, we bring them to our enterprise. So I think this dialogue between the two different set of context and two different set of subjects, I think is one of the dominant feature of this enterprise. Now therefore, instead of simply settling for an interpretation of a text or a context, we are now trying to make it a more lively engagement, lively enterprise, where the entire past is turned into a living reality, a reality which impinges on today's context, and through which we try to find out a more creative and constructive ideas, a more constructive frame through which we can approach our own challenges, and through which we can also peep into the past and look for the resources, some of the resources through which they dealt with their own problems and challenges. So therefore, now this new genre of thinking, one can say, is quite visible in India today, and therefore it is not just a chance that even in the West now we find that Indian studies, particularly the study of Indian political thinkers, study of Indian political thinking, is gaining a lot of legitimacy and also gaining recognition. And most of the Western universities now have started studies, particularly South Asian studies or Indian studies, and giving full attention to Indian thinking and Indian philosophy. They are basically now even amenable to this view that the thought or utopia building enterprise is not West prerogative, but even the East in general and India in particular were equally engaged with this enterprise. They may have some different arguments, they may have different perceptions, they may have different subjecthood, but the thing is that now this recognition that it is not simply confined to the West, but it can also be seen in the East, is a major turning point in the evolution and growth of ideas in modern times. Now it is in passing also required that I should mention that this happened only in modern times. Even in modern times, now a lot of people are engaged with this enterprise, and they are trying to establish that how Indian philosophy fed into the entire Western enterprise, because this modern Western philosophy had two extremes all the times, one hegemonic and one which was challenging it, or one can say counter tradition, a tradition and a counter tradition. And the counter tradition always relied on resources which are emanating from India and other places, and they were being used to challenge the hegemonic discourse of the dominant tradition in the West. And for example, in Germany particularly, Nietzsche and many other made use of the resources of Indian philosophy in a big way, and they offered a big challenge to the dominant discourse of Hegel and others. So I think this is not the reference point at the moment. Therefore, I will sidestep this issue. What I am trying to say, that this recognition has come late in the West, but fact of the matter is that Indian political philosophy from the very beginning has enriched the Western discourse. Not only Indian philosophy, but also the Islamic philosophy of particularly the West Asia, the Persia, Arabia and other parts of the world. And this conflict of non-recognition or selective appropriation, or one can say that appropriation without acknowledgement, is one of the issues which is unresolved between West and the Islamic world till now. And the contemporary discontent in the Islamic world vis-a-vis the West can be seen in terms of their challenge or their resistance or their interrogation of the Western modernity, that how this Western modernity has developed by using the resources which were supplied from the Persia, Arabia and India, and that led to the major breakthrough in modern science and modern philosophy in the West. But subsequently the same discourse came back and treated those cultures, those people and those societies which has generated those ideas which fed into this modern discourse as barbaric and uncivilized, and were subjected to colonization. So I think this is one political issue, and which has a lot of connections with the knowledge system, philosophy and science. But for the time being, what I am interested in, that this recognition is now coming to the Western political thought because of 2-3 factors. Number one, that the crisis which is brewing in the Western discourse itself, and therefore there is again quest to look for alternative set of ideas and resources, and therefore they are looking all around, and India perhaps seems to be one destination. The other is that there is a growing realization within India, and whole host of new arguments are coming, and new politics is also emerging around these ideas. So it is not only in terms of academic activity, but it is also in terms of the societal activity, and therefore there is some convergence between the two at some point of time, though academics is not basically harnessing the two, but nonetheless this political process has this unintended consequence, that there is some sort of convergence taking place, and therefore in Indian studies particularly, at least in certain writings, certain approaches, we can see that there is a growing realization to creatively engage in a dialogue with our own tradition of political thought, and therefore it is perhaps one of the defining moments, one can say, in the evolution of Indian political thought. Now the coming is this modern Indian thought, this entire thing which I put it as a dialogue, where you have a text, context and the subject, and then contemporaneizing all three and engaging with them in the today's context of and in today's societal context, and then having a dialogue between the two. I think this is perhaps visible, mostly visible, and also perhaps easily manageable in case of the modern Indian political thinking and thought. Of course, this is also possible in context of other periods, even if you go by this ancient, medieval and modern characterization. It is also possible in terms of the different philosophical schools, Indian philosophical schools, because interestingly, in India, the philosophy and philosophical ideas were not confined only to the textbooks or the pages of books and manuscripts, but Indian political philosophy was also a living reality. I mean, they have shaped the different culture, different people within the society, and the people have lived their lives through the resources, with the help of the resources supplied by this philosophy. So philosophy is a living reality, and there are many younger scholars who are engaging with this enterprise, that how Indian philosophy as a living reality can be captured and understood, particularly in terms of certain cultural zones in India. I mean, but in context of the modern Indian political thought, this is not only visible but also manageable. Visible because of the closeness in terms of the time, and manageable because of the written resources, and the available are documented largely, of course, due to the colonial states enterprise to record the facts and record the processes of culture and society in order to govern Indian subjects better. So therefore, modern Indian political thought, this dialogical approach, one can say, the dialogue between the two time periods, the time period of colonialism, when the major challenge, because colonialism has been a major reference point for modern Indian thinking. So colonialism and the challenges which it threw before the Indian people, and the responses which emerged due to this challenge, and those responses at times acquired the form of a very profound political thinking about freedom, about equality, about emancipation, and therefore the context and the texts which were produced in those contexts, and the subjects who were engaged with this context, as well as the creation of these texts, and three on the one side, and the dialogue with the present in the sense that present society, present problems and challenges, and the subjects of today's context, and the subjects are the people and the trained social scientists who are trying to understand the two processes. So having a dialogue between the two can result into a much more creative project, a much more creative enterprise, through which we can see that how the resources which have been left to us by them, by our so-called Indian political thinkers, not so-called, but they are the political thinkers, because they came up with certain political ideas. So basically the resources, the tradition bequeathed to us by them, and then using them to reflect and imagine a better future, imagine a better society, and imagine a better politics. So I think this dialogue between the two perhaps is the most decisive moment of today's social science. Now, when coming to the modern political thought, as I told you that it is not only manageable but it is also visible today. The 2-3 concerns through which the modern political thinkers engaged with their own challenges and with their own context and produced certain texts, I think those were the question of understanding the West, because that was their immediate context, because West meant colonialism and imperialism to them. And then the other concern was that analyzing their own subjecthood. I mean, this was another important issue, and therefore this was definitely identity issue, that how to define their own subjecthood. But at the same time, the third important concern, and which perhaps superseded both, was their concern for freedom and emancipation. So therefore, I think all three were linked together. It was not simply an identity trap for them, but it became a basis or resource through which they tried to negotiate with other challenges and arrive at a definitive understanding of freedom and emancipation. Now, this dialogue with the West, or understanding the West and understanding their own subjecthood, had, at least in modern times, particularly for modern thinkers, political thinkers in India, had three important variables. One was modernity, other was science, and the third was progress. Then what is modernity? Because colonialism in the formative phase became a discourse of modernization, because it came to us as in a garb of an argument which is known as white man's burden, and therefore the civilizing mission was basically meant to modernize the subjects, modernize the colonial subjects, and therefore this modernity. Now this modernity was defined in terms of many features, in terms of science, rationality, democracy, nation, history, so on and so forth. And on all these scales, it was declared that the Indians lagged behind, and therefore we should remember the argument of John Stuart Mill and his father James Mill, particularly history of British India. I mean, the way James Mill tried to propagate this ideology that there is a linear progression in history and Indians have lagged behind, and therefore the Britishers have a responsibility towards them to put them back on the path of progress. Now therefore this modernity, and then a related dimension of modernity was science and also progress. So three important reference point for most of the modern political thinkers in India, how to understand this modernity, particularly the way the Western discourse was trying to propagate here, how to understand this science, and therefore how to basically comprehend this progress. Now the offshoot of this modernity, as I have mentioned, was number of things, including secularism, democracy, nation state, and so on and so forth. And the offshoot or the result or the fruits of science were truth and knowledge, that West has progressed because they are in possession of truth, they are in possession of that approach and method which can lead to knowledge, which perhaps Indians are deprived of. And third, the progress. The history is key to progress. Therefore, India doesn't have any history, and therefore, the history has to start in India, and Britishers are basically were saying that they are here to put India in a situation where they can have a proper history. So I think nation state, truth and knowledge, and history as the offshoot of modernity, science, and progress became the important concerns and reference point for interrogating this discourse for Indian political thinkers, because colonialism was an important context of their thinking, but not only the context, but important context, because through which they approached the larger reality of humanity, and then they tried to reflect and imagine a discourse of emancipation. Now all these three issues of modernity, truth, knowledge, and history, on these three issues, an entire modern Indian political thought is crisscrossed and divided among a whole host of ideas and ideologies, and the people who brought different approaches to understand all these three things. Now, from Ram Mohan Roy onwards, there was one stream which always looked at it a gift of the West, and therefore tried to modernize India or try to bring the same modernity to India, through the instrumentality of science, rationality, and the knowledge system as West was propagating. But at the same time, there were important, moments of interrogation of this discourse, and subsequently you discover that the interrogation, the moments of interrogation were more dominant than the moments of imitation. And therefore, the interrogation, the first important interrogation started in late 19th century, when you had the churning from the below. You had a new, within the social religious reform movement, there were various streams. If one stream tried to make it an imitative enterprise, there are other streams which try to harness, the resources at the base, at the bottom, and try to develop alternative sense of modernity, and therefore develop a new utopia. Now there are a lot of studies which are coming regarding such utopia or counter tradition, and perhaps Jyotiba Phule was one such example, when he tried to build one such utopia of emancipation, not only of subjugated people of the society, in terms of caste, but also in terms of gender, particularly women and other sections. So therefore, the moments of interrogation. But subsequently, there were other streams within the national movement when it developed after the formation of Indian National Congress 1885, and perhaps that was the phase of militant nationalism, the Tilak and others, when they interrogated the moderates in politics and tried to develop an alternative discourse of Swaraj and the freedom, and thereby engage with this nationhood and the subjecthood. Therefore, this process went on and on till the time in Gandhi's hands, entire discourse became much more nuanced and became a discourse of Hindu Swaraj. But I will come to this issue later. But what I am trying to, to say here, that there were various streams within this churning, broad churning, which tried to basically, to engage with the three important contexts being offered by the colonialism: the modernity, science, and progress. So one stream was to match them in terms of the creation of a parallel discourse. That if you are saying that Indians lack a history, we can prove that India has had always a very rich and glorious history, and therefore James Mill account of history is fallacious, and we shouldn't buy this argument. Now in this genre of writing, one can put Nehru's Discovery of India, where he tries to present a very syncretic India. What recently Professor Gopal Guru has said, that it is a seamless discourse of India, a discourse where there are no seams, no cracks. One India, syncretic India, people living in harmony, both in terms of religion, caste, and community. And therefore, this glorious history has been disturbed only due to the onset of colonialism, and therefore, if left to themselves, they can again recreate that history, which has been suspended due to the colonial intervention. So Nehru's discovery, in that sense, one can say, is one such moment of creating a parallel discourse, colonial discourse. Matching West with the similar discourse of Indian history. Now, not only in history, but in terms of other issues also, they were trying to prove that there were many agencies and conditions which were available earlier, and again they can be revamped. Again they can be created, through which this modernity can be started, or modernity can be attained in India. So therefore, it is the essential feature of what one can say the nationalist discourse, that creating a parallel discourse, parallel to what exists in the West, and one can say it is imitative in some sense. And Nehru's discovery, as I presented, is perhaps the best example, where he presents this whole grand narrative of India, the idea of India, where there are no cracks, no seams, and therefore the seamless discourse. But it is a different matter that in Nehru's hand it was a political project, and therefore he glossed over the many dimensions which hinted towards the seams and cracks within this idea of India. But he had to gloss over it because it was a political project, meant to counter, the project which was there in the hands of colonialism, particularly as we have seen in case of James Mill and John Stuart Mill. But the second stream, which is represented by Gandhi, realized these issues that, engaging with the West on the issue of history, on the issue of, modernity, science and progress, on their terms are fraught with danger. Therefore, he completely sidesteps these issues. And it is not just a chance that in Hindu Swaraj, the famous treatise which he wrote in 1908, he does not mention the word nation and replaces it with civilization. Because he thought that if he basically entered in this dangerous zone of nation, then there will be problems. Because nation, the way the West has understood in terms of linguistic or racial enterprise, India will have difficulty, and therefore he sidestepped this issue and engaged with the question of progress in terms of civilizational questions. And therefore, the truth and knowledge and history, I think all these issues he dealt at a different level. For example, he completely discarded this notion of history. One can say that for him, this dictum played important role, that happy are the people who have no history, because history is a problematic thing. And therefore, he didn't try to define and judge the scale of progress, the scale of civilization on basis of history, but in terms of ethics, good and bad, what is good and what is bad. And he tested the colonialism and the Western world on this scale, a scale of goodness, not on the scale of evolution of history, which perhaps people like Nehru were doing through discovery of India. But at the same time, Gandhi's Hindu Swaraj also marks a beginning of a new discourse of emancipation and utopia building. As we discussed in the beginning, that it is believed in the West that utopia building is essentially Western project, and Indians don't have this capability. Therefore, Indian political thinkers should not acquire that stature or that status of a political thought. Now, Hindu Swaraj that way can be considered an important break, in the sense that it is a project of utopia building. Now, apart from this parallel discourse which Nehru tried to create of colonialism, an alternative discourse which Gandhi tried to create, which I have mentioned, there are other streams as well, and one can put it as a counter tradition, an attempt to not only interrogate the colonial discourse but also interrogate the nationalist discourse, and therefore try to find a new subjecthood and find out a niche for those subjects which were neither recognized nor visible within the colonial discourse as well as the nationalist discourse. And therefore, here one can mention the discourse which was basically taken forward by people like Ambedkar. For example, the discourse which earlier I mentioned can be associated with the name of Phule, and many such discourse at the micro levels which were taking place. But the most important discourse at that level was, of course, developed by Ambedkar, and therefore his Annihilation of Caste and other writings are equally important, where not only tries to draws attention toward the seams and the cracks within this idea of India or this nation, which was tried to be covered through patches or was tried to be cemented by taking recourse to a political project of history or imaginative history which Nehru tried to do in discovery, but it also tried to create a subjecthood for those people through recourse to the interpretation of traditional Indian philosophy and history. And therefore, the entire concept of Dalit Buddhist category which Ambedkar brought and associated with the classical Buddhist philosophy of India was attempt in that direction, because for him the nationalist discourse was seamless, but at the same time colonial discourse was frameless, because the colonial discourse did not allow any value to such subjects which Dalits represented, and nationalist discourse didn't allow any visibility to those subjects which the Dalits represented. So therefore, these counter traditions were another significant attempt to engage with the three things: the modernity, science, and progress, and at the same time the fruits of all three, like nation state and history and truth and knowledge. So I think now there is a attempt to engage with all such strands of thought in India, and to see that how they offered a profound understanding not only of society and people, but also about emancipation and humanity. Therefore, this tradition modernity trap through which Indian political thinking has has suffered, or through the prism, because it's through the prism, the prism of tradition and modernity, through which people have tried to look at Indian political thought. Now that is being discarded, and a more dialogical approach through which a dialogue is being sought to be established between the subjects, the text, and the subject, text, context, and the subjects of that period, and the challenges and the context of our today's life, so that it is made most contemporaneous and it becomes helpful for creating a more emancipatory project for India today.
So, in your view, how the present situation, or you can say, will take shape if you see from the perspective of modern political science thinker in coming years?
In fact, I was just trying to hint at that some of the trends which we can see today, both in society, in politics, as well as in social science. And I was also mentioning that consciously or unconsciously there is some sort of convergence taking place, and it has always happened because people sometimes live through certain ideas which are the product of their culture, their philosophy, and their life processes. So I think such thing has always been there in India, and therefore Indian philosophy has always influenced the life cycle of people in this part of the world. And in today's context, we can see that this engagement, with our own tradition of political thinking, our resources which were bequeathed by them, and the challenges which we are encountering today, I think consciously or unconsciously some engagement is taking place at the level of politics. Now, what shape it will take would basically be decided by human intervention. That how politics acts as a cutting edge, and how harnesses these resources and tries to build a more human discourse, more emancipatory discourse, where the challenges of today's world are also incorporated, and then they are incorporated and interpreted, and through which a more systematic framework is evolved for our engagement with the global and the national challenges.
Okay. So, well, friends, as Dr. Satish Jha said and explained the various political thoughts and stream of present India, you can say the present political system. So, and also he said while explaining the text, we need to have in the mind the context of the text. So, with these words, we would like to conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. Satish Jha for giving such an insightful lecture. Thank you very much.